Professor Ruth Wodak, thank you so very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. How do you interpret the contemporary resurgence of fascist traits in democratic societies, especially in the light of anti-fascism declaration you co-signed on June 13, 2025? In your view, what are the key discursive markers we should be most vigilant of, both conceptually and in concrete political communication? Could you provide some recent illustrative examples from campaign speeches, media discourse, or policy debates that exemplify this trait in action?
Well, I think that's a huge question. There are, unfortunately, some examples of what you explained right now and asked. First, I would like to say that we should be careful when using the term fascism, yeah? Because it always leads us to associate the 1930s and National Socialism, Mussolini, etc. So we should be aware what are the main characteristics of fascism. And one which is important to mention is the existence of violence and paramilitary movements which support a fascist movement or government. Now, what we can observe right now is that there is more and more violence happening, especially now. To give you an example, in the US, quite recently, we saw the violence which took place in Los Angeles, for example, where the ICE in the US and also the National Guards were called in by President Trump to catch, so to say, so-called illegal migrants and to deport them basically to camps in El Salvador and other South American countries. And those camps do resemble in some ways to concentration camps. Most surprisingly and disturbing was that actually Donald Trump had pictures taken of himself in such a camp, somehow really being proud of this kind of actions. Now, when we think back just a few years, if you remember Charlottesville and the riots which took place there, sort of because of the attempt to move the statue of a so-called hero during the war in America, Confederation. And the Proud Boys, the so-called Proud Boys, which is a really fascist movement of young, mainly men, killed a young woman. And Trump then said, well, actually, both the protesters and the Proud Boys were to be seen in an equal way. Yeah, so we do see that currently the government in the US is taking very violent actions. We can still see them in kind of a snapshot. Yeah, they are localized in Los Angeles or elsewhere. They're not covering the entire country. But of course, this might be a symbol of what is to come. I think it's very dangerous. And if you look back, you asked me about speeches, yeah, and rallies. There was a speech of Trump where a protester entered the rally, and Trump just said, "Beat him up." Yeah. So you can really also observe a rhetoric which is in which orders or supports people to implement violence. But this is not only the case, of course, in the US, it's just the case which we're all very aware of. If you look at Turkey, for example, where the mayor of Istanbul was taken into prison, and again, we have violence enacted by the government because it's not like he would be taken to court and there would be a trial, and then, you know, the democratic procedures would be implemented. But this mayor is just taken to prison. Nobody knows how long he will stay there. As far as I know, yeah, I depend on the media, you know much more about this. We also see violence, but again, very localized in Germany, where there is not any fascist sort of movement which we can observe, except very small groups of neo-Nazis and identitarians. But we see assassinations of and attacks on prominent politicians. There was an attack on a social democratic politician before the election. There are attacks on green politicians. A mayor was actually shot. So this is all very disconcerting. And if we even look back a little more, if you remember Golden Dawn, which is obviously a paramilitary fascist movement, which was very strong in Greece, 2010 and a bit later. They were enacting a lot of violence against migrants. And actually, this only became really scandalized when they killed a well-known Greek pop singer. Then suddenly it was talked about, but Golden Dawn had symbols of fascism and so forth. So there is sort of a trend which is leading up to the violence which we see enacted right now. And of course, I don't want to talk about Russia or because there, this violence against protesters or opposition politicians has been ongoing for decades.
Right, right, Professor. The declaration highlights techno-fascist enthusiasts among media barons. How do you conceptualize the role of digital platforms and algorithmic governance in sustaining what you call the politics of fear?
Well, first, let me say what the politics of fear is about. The politics of fear means that political groups or parties instrumentalize usually existing crises, or they actually exaggerate crisis. They even sometimes create crisis quite artificially through fake news and disinformation. And they instrumentalize such crises to create scenarios of threat and fear. Yeah? So very dystopian scenarios of decay, of the end of the country, of terrible things which will be happening. And then the leader of the party or the group which is doing this stages him or herself, because there are also women who do this, as the savior. So we have a sort of link between, on the one hand, creating this scenario of fear, and on the other hand, creating this vision or utopia of the savior who will save the country, who will get rid of the people who are to blame for creating problems and so forth. And this involves creating scapegoats, because somebody must be to blame, somebody must be guilty for the huge problems which exist. And there are many possible scapegoats. This really depends on the context. So sometimes they are Turks and migrants, and sometimes they're Jews and Roma. It really depends on who is just sort of available to be constructed as a scapegoat. And in this way, the narrative is very simple. Yeah, there is danger. So and so is to blame for this problem. I am the savior. I will get rid of this problem, and everything will be okay. And this is a very simple narrative and a simple argument, but many people who are currently very insecure because of the polycrisis which we are all experiencing seem to be easy to manipulate to believe in such a simple narrative. And now we come to the social media, who play a very big role in this manipulation and in this propaganda. If we think of the big um, uh, social media networks, for example, X, yeah, to talk about Elon Musk, who's obviously the richest man on earth. So we have somebody who owns such a huge network and who can actually manipulate the content. And in this way, such dangerous contents and such disinformation is distributed widely, and evidence and factual evidence against such narratives is either deleted or anyway not distributed or less distributed. And apart from that, we also then have trolls and bots who distribute it even more. So the whole, I would like to say, second discourse world of the social media is full of this disinformation. And there is not enough, I would say, counter information. Yeah? We do have, for example, now Blue Sky, which tries to counter X, in some ways quite successfully. Many people have changed from X to Blue Sky as a form of protest. But still, X is, of course, more powerful because it's connected to this enormous amount of money. And in that way, I would say power and money are going together right now in a really unpredictable way. We haven't experienced that for a long time. I just want to point to the Russian oligarchs after 1989, but that was also localized. Now we have a quite global kleptocracy and oligarchy, which is owning the social media and is part of some governments. And I want to point to the recent book by Anne Applebaum, I think, which is very interesting, which is called Autocracy, Inc. Yeah, the corporation. So autocracy has become a big economic corporation. Yeah, because power is linked to money and to specific groups of libertarians, of very powerful people, of oligarchs who are supported by governments and who have enormous power.
Right. The declaration refers to fabricated enemies and the weaponization of security. How have right-wing populist actors and used crisis narratives like migration and pandemics to justify authoritarian measures?
You mean how this is done, or is it happening? Could you tell
How
me?
have right-wing populist actors used crisis narratives like migration and pandemics to justify authoritarian measures?
Well, we see that happening all the time. I mean, migration has become such such an important agenda in this construction of fear. And looking at recent EU barometers, it's actually quite interesting that other topics seem to also create a lot of fear, but are not instrumentalized in the same way. The statistics show us that, for example, the fear of the cost of living crisis, the fear of the energy crisis, the fear of the climate crisis, the fear of wars. Yeah, we have for the first time since the 1990s in the Yugoslavian wars, a war very close to Europe or in Europe, yeah, Ukraine. All of that could actually also be talked about a lot and be used to create fear. But it seems to be migration, which is for the far right, the so-called best agenda to be instrumentalized. And that is throughout. I mean, I cover especially the Austrian and German debates, but I also look at the French and British debates. And I've just read The Guardian yesterday, where there were anti-foreigner riots in Manchester and in another city in the north of England. And I was really disturbed because, as you know, I've lived in the UK for 12 years in the north, and I have never encountered that. I mean, there's xenophobia everywhere, yeah, but to have these riots which were triggered by far-right groups, this is really very scary in the UK.
Right.
And again, if you look at Austria, the extreme right, far right party, the Austrian Freedom Party, is leading the polls since 2022, has won the last national election. They are not in the government, but right now they are still leading the polls. And their main agenda is constructing the fear of migrants. And it's really a paradox because on the one hand, it's obvious that in all European countries or all countries of the European Union, specialist workers and people who are specialists in various professions are needed, and there are special ways of allowing them to enter the various countries, special permits and whatnot. And on the other hand, this fear of migration still seems to get so much resonance. And we have to ask why the construction of this scapegoat is so successful.
Mm.
And it is especially, and it's again, not only against Muslim migrants, because we had this fear of migrants already as a huge manipulative device, so to say, already 1989. If you recall the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, sort of the end of the so-called Eastern Bloc. And you recall that there were many people from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Poland entering the West, yeah, the so-called West, and coming to the West. The Freedom Party in Austria, and especially Jörg Haider, who was quite a charismatic and very clever rhetorician, constructed his whole agenda against foreigners and became very successful. So
Right.
it's very much, and that was not in times of crisis. There was no economic crisis at that time. So we did a big study at that time. We saw that the discursive patterns used at that time are very similar to the discursive patterns used now, except at that time there were white Christian people, and now we have Muslims coming from Syria or Iraq or refugees. Yeah?
Right.
But basically, the discourse of exclusion is very similar.
Mhm.
And if you ask yourself what triggers this enormous fear, I think there are basically two, possibly many more, but two really important points. And one is the fear of losing control, which has become salient in the poly-crisis, but which was also very visible during the Brexit campaign. So the fear of losing control because there are so many people coming, and then you don't know what's happening anymore. Yeah. So the slogan at that time in the UK was "Take back control." It was very successful. And the second big issue is the fear of losing your social welfare, all the benefits, your jobs, sort of they will take things away. Yeah. So you haven't lost them yet, but you might lose out. So it's not just the people who have already lost out, which is always talked about. It's the fear of the middle class, yeah? And the lower middle class of losing their status, their sort of benefits, their way of living. And that also explains why, for example, in very rich countries like Austria, like Denmark, like Switzerland, like Sweden, the far right is so huge.
Right, right, Professor. The open letter evokes the historical memory of anti-fascist intellectuals in 1925. How do you see the role of public intellectuals and discourse scholars today in resisting what you have termed shameless normalization?
Well, I think it's a hard job. And it really is difficult to summarize or even to observe what impact public intellectuals might have. Because public intellectuals are, of course, part of the elite, the so-called elite, which the far right is basically campaigning against. So public intellectuals form a group of what is not wanted by far right. But we can say that, sorry, there's something there. We can say that it's really important that people speak out. Yeah. And the more people speak out and are listened to, and their voice is heard in also the social media, newspapers, and so forth, people become aware that there is a different position. Yeah, there's a counter discourse. And I believe that to be very important, even if it's not distributed by X or whatever kind of huge distribution devices. So the more people speak out, I think the better it is. And one shouldn't be afraid of speaking out. Now, this really depends of where you live, of course. If you live in a dictatorship or in an authoritarian, quasi-authoritarian country, public intellectuals will probably have a very hard time and might be put into prison, which is happening, or might be killed. Yeah, if we look at Russia or of China, of course, but if we look at Turkey, they will be put into prison, like also many journalists have been imprisoned, so they are forced to go into exile and speak out of exile. But if you live in a country which still allows the freedom of opinion and sort of supports the human rights and the Human Rights Charter, then even more it is important to speak out, because basically you have the right to do it.
Right.
And you shouldn't be afraid to do it. And in that way, myself, I have never been afraid to speak out. I have, of course, encountered much opposition. I'm not liked by some people, but again, I tell myself I don't have to be loved by everybody. And I see also many colleagues in the US who speak out, or in Germany, who give lectures, and not only, let's say, at conferences and in the academic environment, but who leave this ivory tower and who also speak at schools or in other publics where they are invited to. And I basically also believe, to come to one of your next questions, that it is very important not to be frightened preemptively, especially in sort of countries where there is freedom of opinion, where you shouldn't be afraid to be imprisoned or killed or something similar. There is no way to basically stop you to speak out. And this preemptive fear is very dangerous, because it leads you to accommodate to some kind of danger which you envision, but which is actually not there. And in this way, I would say that I encourage scholars, intellectuals who are able to speak out, to speak out.
Right. How would you analyze the role of Trump's Make America Great Again narrative and the narratives of Erdogan, Putin, Netanyahu, Modi, Orbán, you name it, not just rhetorically, but also in terms of its effective and mobilizing power? What makes such slogans so resonant across diverse audiences, and how do they function discursively to both obscure and legitimate regressive political agendas?
Well, these slogans, and I would say these are really slogans, the MAGA, for example, resonate because many, as I already said, many people are afraid, feel insecure, legitimately also, because there are existential crises right now. And these slogans construct a past which seems to be much better. Yeah, I say seem because it never was much better. There were always problems, always crises, etc. We made a study which once looked at all the crises which the European Union had experienced until 2009. And it really showed a continuity of crisis. Yeah, there were always crises. So you could say even the EU was kind of continuing from one crisis to the next. So it's basically what Bauman calls retrotopia. It's a fantasy, an imaginary of a past which was much better. Now we can think of what does Trump actually, or what might he mean when pointing to such a past? And it's quite obvious, I think, that the past which is sort of indicated might be the past before the civil rights movement, a past where the traditional gender roles were still enacted, where there was no political correctness, and so forth. So a past which some people really would like to go back to, or to sort of evoke again. But of course, this is impossible. We cannot turn the clock back. And in that way, it remains an absolute fantasy or imaginary, but it resonates because there is much nostalgia. There is nostalgia, there is a lot of anger, and there is a lot of what Eva Illouz calls also love and patriotism, and sort of this imaginary where we all were together in some kind of imaginary white community in the US, where all these values were still enacted, resonates well. And
Right.
this is the same, of course, in other contexts where you have to look at the historical elements which are pointed to.
Right. And lastly, Professor Wodak, you have researched the discourse of European far right extensively. How would you compare the current discourse strategies of far right and populist actors in Austria or Hungary with those of in the United States, Turkey, and India?
Well, I have not researched Turkey and India sort of extensively because I don't speak the languages. Yeah, and it's of course for us as linguists and discourse analysts, it's always important to look at the original texts, visual, written, oral, because we need to understand all the nuances, the intonation, the latent meanings, and so forth. So translation is not enough. But if I now say what is reported, yeah, what I can read about this, and if I look, as I already cited examples from the US, there is a difference in these authoritarian countries or neo-authoritarian countries to the, of course, still liberal democracies. So what, for example, if we look at Italy, where Giorgia Meloni is leading the government, and she comes from a fascist movement, which she claims she has left completely. We see an example, I would say, of soft fascism, yeah, because she balances between the EU and is still also a friend of Trump, but she wants the money of the EU not to stop, so she negotiates in a nice way with van der Leyen and with the European People's Party. She is for Ukraine and against Russia and so forth. So there are many interesting positions. But in the actual policies inside Italy, her party attacks journalists. There are attacks on press freedom, on freedom of opinion, freedom of assembly, and so forth. However, the civil society in Italy is very strong, so this is also opposed. And this is a difference, or in some way, to Hungary, where Orbán has really implemented a authoritarian state. But the civil society and the opposition right now is growing. So it's not clear what is going to happen next year at the elections, because there is a conservative opposition party led by Magyar, which is leading the polls since several months.
Mhm.
And if we look at Austria and Germany, again, this kind of explicit violent speech would not be possible. I mean, if it is possible sometimes by some politicians, but this is scandalized, and such politicians might also be suspended from their parties, especially if they say things which appeal to the fascist past. So there are laws against that. And they're quite strict, these laws, so you cannot use these symbols and so forth. Whereas, and that's a big difference to the US, where obviously Trump violates all these laws and uh, human rights right now, and all the taboos, and there's not much opposition, not that we see. Yeah. So I think there is a difference because of the EU legislation, and then in national contexts where violence and the breaking of taboos is still scandalized, forbidden, taken to court, all of that, and countries where the government can actually break all these taboos and act against the laws, and it seems that everything goes.
Right. Professor Ruth Wodak, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the very interesting questions. I'm sure we could have gone on to discuss this in many other ways, and I hope that I have answered what was of interest to you.
You did actually. Thank you so much.